Thank you all so much for being here. I think, as should be customary, please give yourselves a round of applause for being here in the middle of the week talking about AI. I also want to extend a tremendous thank you to Honor Fraser for continuing to host thoughtful, experimental conversations that many galleries, neither galleries nor museums would be necessarily willing to embrace and make space for. I feel tremendously lucky to have worked with Honor a couple times now, and I'm also tremendously grateful that she hired Jameson Edgar and Altrina Marufi, wonderful, wonderful people. Rounds of applause. This show, Small Voice, which I curated, is really a collaboration with the artists and with the three of them, and I feel, again, tremendously lucky. I also feel tremendously lucky to be able to have this conversation with you in comfort right now. There are people around the world who are experiencing incredible harm and experiencing a lack of even the basic necessities to live and engaged in liberation struggles. My heart goes out to them, and I, again, feel grateful that we can be here, and I want to acknowledge that not everybody is so lucky. With that being said, we are talking about AI today, and we're talking about AI through the lens of can AI be ethical? And the reason that it's framed that way and not can AI be used ethically is that AI is both refers to a technological paradigm, but it also refers to a geopolitical system, a mythology, and other ways of thinking about intelligence and pattern recognition. So that has caused a number of conversations around what the future of intelligence and consciousness are. And so when we say, can AI be ethical, we are talking about it across the full dimension of what, how anybody might be approaching this topic. I'm not claiming that we will get to everything we would necessarily want to get to under that topic, so please follow these amazing speakers now so you can keep up with their work and learn from them more. With that being said, I'm going to do some quick intros, and then we are going to get to it. To my immediate left is Anuradha Vikram, a writer, curator, and educator based in Los Angeles. As a curator and critic of contemporary art, they work with process-based, public, and participatory art forms with a focus on transcultural approaches to technology, social engagement, and the body. Vikram is co-curator of the upcoming Getty Pacific Standard Time Art and Science LA exhibition in 2024, Atmosphere of Sound, Sonic Art in Times of Climate Disruption, with Victoria Vesna at UCLA Art Sci Center. Next we have Holly Willis. Holly Willis is the chair of the Media Arts Practice Division in USC's School of Cinematic Arts, where she teaches classes on digital media, post-cinema, and feminist film. She also co-directs the AI for Media and Storytelling Initiative of the USC Center for Generative AI in Society. She is the author of Fast Forward, The Futures of the Cinematic Arts and New Digital Cinema, Reinventing the Moving Image, as well as of Bjork Digital, and the editor of both The New Ecology of Things, a collection of essays about ubiquitous computing, and David O. Russell Interviews. She's also the co-founder of Filmmaker Magazine, dedicated to independent film. And finally, we have Stephen Vargas, who is a journalist, actor, and dancer who focused his work on theater, dance, and social change. He graduated from USC in 2020 with a BA double major in theater and journalism with a minor in dance, and in 2022 with an MA in specialized journalism, the arts. He is currently he was formerly an arts reporter for the Los Angeles Times. He's previously written for Entertainment Weekly, E! News, USA Today, BuzzFeed News, and more. All three of these people, truly, I say this in full acknowledgement of my bias, are really tremendously important people, not just in Los Angeles, but broadly in terms of how they're thinking about this stuff. Please follow them and check out their even more extensive bios. I don't want to spend too much time on that today. So we frame this conversation as a debate, and I'm looking at that topic not in terms of the sort of political dunking that we often associate with debate, and more thinking about it in terms of dialogos, getting into tough conversations and being able to be critical without that being read as knee-jerk optimism or pessimism. To that end, I wanted to open up to all three of you. Let's maybe start with a temperature check. How are you feeling about AI? We're at a very complicated, interesting moment with this technology, and we're in an arts context, but how are you feeling about it broadly?
well, I'll start. I think in light of some of the issues that you raised in your introduction quite saliently, I haven't really been thinking about AI terribly much in the last few months, except to think about to what extent AI is being used in the ongoing colonial occupations that take place around the world. What extent is AI being used in policing and in criminalizing deviant bodies? My concern, I will say this probably several times throughout today's conversation, and I say it over and over, is less with AI and more with this society that we live in, which has really refined the art of taking anything wonderful and turning it into dirt. So I have a lot of great positivity about what AI could do, but I really only have anxiety about what AI will be used to do.
I guess I can follow. I feel schizophrenic. On the one side, I echo what you're saying. I feel a lot of anxiety, a lot of terror. All of the qualities in our current contemporary culture that we find abhorrent are amplified and exaggerated with systems that have the power that AI has. On the other side, I see what artists are doing. I see the transformation of certain practices. I see new ways of expressing ideas and concepts through new aesthetics. And I'm really curious myself about, especially from my area of expertise, or not expertise, but of interest, with cinema. Sort of what is the future of cinema and the moving image in this context as we move from something that used to index light in the world onto emulsion, and there was that kind of direct representation, versus something that's generated through software. So moving from a culture of representation and a certain notion of truth and the self and the body and the world to one that's statistical, that's computational, not to sort of give a valence, a positive or negative to either, but what is that culture that is going to be represented through this computational modality. So I was on a panel last week, and the first question from the students after I had given an introduction and sort of made a list of all of the horrors, and then we had this incredible conversation with filmmakers about how exciting it was, and he was like, this is ridiculous. You said it was bad, but now you're saying it's good. And I feel that polarization, I think, on a daily basis.
Yeah, I also feel very ambivalent about AI. Just recently, I read an article from, I believe it was a Wall Street Journal, I can't quite remember, but about how AI is being used in job applications and how it very much affects like women and people of color who are applying because of the way that AI is set up and how, like it has been said, is reflective of who we are as a society at the end of the day, because it was created by us. So it's a very interesting look at AI, because that's happening. Then at the same time, there's like great art being made out of AI, and yeah, it's just it's all over. Yeah.
If we could, I'd love to extend this conversation and maybe think about factoring for a full range of expertise and understanding in the room. What would you identify as a key or a couple key harms that you see being most prevalent that we should consider most thoroughly or most readily? And then also, and these are potentially related, what might you think of being modes of mitigating those harms, or what might be things unrelated to those harms that you think could be productive in a societal context when thinking from ethical and moral positions?
You didn't mention the novel in the bio, so I'll mention that. I wrote a novel that I published in July called Use Me at Your Own Risk, Visions from the Darkest Timeline, and I mapped out some of what I think the big harms are. And I think one of the biggest harms is actually the fact that we are so unaware of the ubiquity of AI in the way that we live our lives now. That, everything from our bus timetables to our Instagram photos is governed by AI. The way we relate to one another is governed by AI. And what is it doing to us as people? What is it doing to the way we understand each other, the way the generations relate to each other? I'm not sure I could list three harms. I can say that the ubiquity of AI governing our relations in all things is really, really harmful and really insidious and invisible, and we don't really see it happening.
Yeah, I feel like AI has just really been something that has become part of our everyday life. Like, I even think how cavalier it is. Like, even in my day-to-day job as a journalist, I will upload transcripts to a website that transcribes it and helps me make my life easier. And there are ways that it could be used as a tool, but then there are also like very, very harmful ways in which it can impact how we view the world. Because once all of the, I forgot where my train of thought went. Do you want to pick up?
Yeah, I would echo the idea that it's really become so much of a part of our everyday lives that it's kind of ubiquitous and we don't even notice it. And we, in that not noticing, have ceded a lot of power to other people to make decisions on our behalf. And now we're sort of waking up and saying, wait a minute, we didn't agree to this. We weren't part of the conversation. We weren't part of the group that got to say how these things got used and how they're unfolding. So that would be one thing, and I think the second thing, I mean, there's such a long list of things to talk about. I mean, you have the war, and use of drones, and surveillance, and policing, and the list goes on. But I just read a really nice piece by Kate Crawford that was documenting the environmental impact and the harms just since November 2022, when sort of ChatGPT became something that we all suddenly knew about, and then the other tools that are there. The impact on the environment is very material, it's very real, and it's very, very harmful. So I think for me, as a professor, literacy is kind of the go-to answer for these kinds of questions, and all of us understanding what these tools are, how they impact the world, the environment, how they are creating who we are as beings in relationship to each other. I was just listening to social scientists talk about the way we're sucked into different social media applications, and he was using traps as the model, sort of the ways in which a long time ago we would catch animals to eat, and the way that they're formed to lure you in, and it plays on the desire of particular kinds of animals and their particular foibles. And he was making a direct corollary to social media. We're drawn in by very specific ways, and then we're hooked, and we can't live without it. And we're moving in the world and thinking thoughts based on these things, again, that we're not really acquiesced to fully or consciously.
You're all interdisciplinary thinkers, but I want to tease out from each of you one aspect of your expertise and your scholarship in thinking about these questions. Stephen, if you don't mind, I'd love to start with you. You referenced using transcription tools in your journalistic work. I'd love to hear how you as a journalist are squaring using AI, but also you've covered AI extensively, and those have been incredibly important in the shaping of that dialogue. What are you thinking about as your responsibility and the opportunities that might exist in using those tools paired with some of the harms that we just named?
Yeah, I think whenever I wrote my first article on AI, there was a lot of questions still in the air, a lot of hesitancy around it, a lot of concern, and it was very much like a mixed bag, and literally like from the time that it published to like 3 months later, the entire conversation had shifted. And I think that whenever I use it in my everyday life, and as I started to think more critically about how it comes up in my work, I started to recognize that as I started to speak with different artists who are using it for different purposes, the way that we interact with it as a tool specifically shapes how it can either be harmful or not harmful. So, for example, I wrote a piece on Rashad Newsom's Hands performance, where they fed AI a bunch of information on critical race theory, voguing, ballroom culture, and what was created was an AI humanoid that really focused on equality and also an archive of Black vernacular dance and Black vernacular movement. And that kind of stuff is is where there's like a light and like, oh, this is what AI can do. But then on the flip side of that, the people who go into using AI for more harmful reasons or go into it without actually knowing all too much because they're so hyped up on the idea of what AI is, then that's what then harmful things start to happen because we don't, even to this day, we don't really know that much about AI. And I think going into the future of what AI looks like in our daily lives, we have to be more cognizant and understanding of what possibilities there are with it. Because we have to be a lot more careful. Yeah, because it can be a tool and it can also not.
And Holly, you referenced your work as an educator. You also teach in media arts practice, which is part of the film school, and were announced as being the co-chair of the Center for Generative AI in Society, right at the doorstep of a major strike in the film industry. How were you thinking about taking on that role at that time when one of the main points of the strike was the application of AI in the creative process?
That's a great point. It was a very difficult timing issue. And I think that one of the things that I saw with people associated with the strike, and I want to be careful here, there was a certain lack of understanding among some of the people I was in contact with about what machine learning was, about what AI was. And my sense was that if there had been more education and more awareness, the ability to bargain might have been stronger. And I don't want to disparage anyone. I was not part of the bargaining, so I don't want to suggest that I was or that I have any kinds of insights. But I think looking at my colleagues within our school, our level of understanding could be greater. So I felt that there was a need to kind of have all of us get together and level up our understanding and our expertise so that we could actually speak and be leaders in part of this conversation rather than being told, this is how it is and this is how you make it work. I really think we need to understand how these things work and then also really be part of the decision making rather than being told this is it. And then I think in terms of my students, there was a lot of fearfulness. They're saying, why am I going to a film school when I can just go home and make these things, on my computer? So sort of coming to, I think I spun up the class very quickly, was teaching myself things very quickly, and kind of created a workshop environment where we're all investigating these tools together. And I think one of the things that became clear was that certain things like understanding story structure, understanding a visual language are still very, very important as you enter and use these tools. And then having an awareness of communities of practice and what it means for people to be employed and how important it is to preserve that and to attend to it and not just say, this is inevitable, this is how it is, and which seemed to be the thought. So I think that there needs to be more active considerations of how people are employed, how we make money, how we kind of have communities of practice, and how important those are to sustain.
No, I love that. I really appreciate that. And Anu, picking up from your book, I think there's a lot of ways I could frame this question, because in doing that sort of scenario forecasting aspect, it gets into what would the context of the future where these tools have run amok be. I think what I feel most drawn to ask you in this moment is, how would you imagine, looking to 2046 on a maybe slightly brighter timeline, or something that would be an antidote to some of the darker timelines, what would we need to do as a democratic collective of people, or in concert with the current sort of governmental apparatus that we're faced with? What could we do in your mind, or what are some things you're thinking about that feel like, wow, if we could do that or be pushing into that territory, we might actually ward off some of the darker realities?
Okay, that's a huge question, but let me start really, really small with something off of what Holly was saying, which is that one of the themes that also emerges, particularly around conversations around how will AI affect artists, is that if the artist is the creative director of the project, then the artist will always have a role. But if the artist is the implementation tool, the hands of the project, they will quickly be replaced by these tools which essentially appropriate handmade work into a new digitized mode. So when it comes to education and educating artists, who I believe very strongly that educating artists is one of the ways that we can potentially correct against a lot of these problems. And so even writing a dystopian novel is my way of saying, hey, it could look like this, or it could look like something else if we pay a little attention. I do think that empowering artists is a huge, important part of that. So if we continue down this path that we're currently on, where creative artists are exploited by these systems, their work is taken without copyright, fair use doctrine is essentially skirted with these really shady uses of 501c3s, where the company is not really a nonprofit company, but they're using the 501c3 in order to claim fair use so they can outright steal copyrighted material. This is happening a lot. It's happening with Books 3. It's happening with Midjourney, and it's just really concerning the way in which we're not treating human beings as creators. We're just treating them as labor. And automating labor is efficient, and it works. But what we do as human beings is much more than manual labor. What we do is strategize, we problem solve, we invent, we notice problems, we shift, we communicate with one another, we build relationships, we work in relation. Computers work in a different kind of relation. They work in nodes and they work in networks. But that is a very flat kind of experiential range. And so again, working with young people, my biggest concern is that young people are actually developing an extremely flat experiential and emotional range. And when anything happens that exists outside of that, they react as if it's a violation of some kind, because the amount of emotional range that they've been able to experience comfortably is so narrow. And a lot of this has to do with the flattening of their social experience, because so much of it is shifted online. AI is part of that. It's not all of that. But the economic forces that are driving that shift online are also driving the shifts with AI. And again, I think a lot of this is intended to turn us into an exploitable labor resource and ultimately excise us completely from the labor equation. The results will be much worse, but nobody cares, or at least nobody who makes the decisions cares. So I think, again, what's interesting about being in LA, and why I chose to move to LA to do my work as a curator, why I chose to write a novel ultimately that is at least partly set in Los Angeles, and also occupies a space that could potentially interface with other forms of entertainment like television or movies. It's science fiction, it's not an art criticism book. And this is all because this is an environment where we can actually amplify some of these messages to a level that can reach people who are the power to make these decisions, who are very hard to reach and are making these decisions from a very out-of-touch position. So that's what I think needs to change. Again, it's hard for me to talk about the systems, because the systems themselves are neither good nor bad.
I really appreciate that. And also, if either of you, feel free to popcorn and respond if I don't know if either of you did. Okay. Yeah, I so appreciate that, and I want to extend a kind of line of question around the role of the artist and also the role of art. There was a pretty buzzy viral critique that I saw a lot of people react strongly to, that I want to sort of quickly paraphrase here, which is and you've probably seen it in a million different ways, that using large models is sort of a great homogenizer, that you're able to get perfectly competent imagery, but it's devoid of the idiosyncrasies that would rise it to the level of great design or great art. So my first question is, how do you feel about that critique? And then second of all, elaborate on what you think would be cases where that wouldn't happen, or cases where that would be in the hands of artists to, adapt or mold.
So maybe I can talk a little bit about language models or models in general. Large models are preferable because they are more adaptable, because they have so much information. But they're also not preferable because they're so enormous that you can't really correct them for bias. Small models are difficult because they could be too small to actually generate anything demonstrably new out of the parts, because the AI is not inventing anything, it's really recombining, mining and recombining at this incredibly fast rate in so many iterations that it feels new. And that is a part of invention. It's not that it's not inventing at all, but it's only the very beginning of invention. So a lot of artists are working with small models where they can create, they can control the data input, and they can also write the algorithms and correct for bias. But I would say when it comes to large models, mostly what we're seeing is human beings being paid exploitation wages, usually in different countries than ours, to correct the models. So especially when GPT-4 came out, and it was so hyped as being so incredible, there was a thing that you would notice sometimes where you would put in a prompt and it would start to write something, and then that text would disappear and something else would come up. That is a person probably in Nigeria or Ghana or Ethiopia who is paid to scrub any responses that they think will be problematic, politically problematic, upsetting, too uncanny. And so the only way to correct for these things with large models is actually to employ humans at really low wages to fix it by hand.
I think more deeper, just specifically focusing on like something that you mentioned was how large models also has a lot of bias incorporated into it. Because the one thing that really concerns me about that is that in those kinds of things, it's pulling from a lot, and it's specifically pulling from our history, and that becomes very concerning because, like I mentioned when at the very start, like from the article that I read, like in that specific situation, companies would employ AI to sift through all the applications, and the data that they were using was like their previous data of like the people that they used to hire. And of course, that data showed that they're mainly hiring men. So it's stuff like that that becomes very prevalent within larger models, and that's something that I really dove into in my reporting, specifically when it comes to race and the kinds of things that come up whenever we use larger models. That's one of the big concerns that really comes up for me when it comes to that critique. Yeah.
I don't really have much to say about large language models, but I would say that I'm curious about the ways in which artists are using smaller models. I didn't see the film, but at Sundance this year, there was a film about Brian Eno where they collected his body of work and created a kind of durational 168-hour project that every time it's seen in a theater context is a different project altogether. And there are other examples of that with my students. They were often taking large amounts of their own drawings and creating their own sort of art-making systems. And that to me was really interesting to think about how you would reimagine your own creative practice in collaboration with this machine that's kind of reflecting back to you certain things about yourself, but also errors, and then sort of the interaction between those two seems to be an amazing possibility for not only creative output, but for thinking about what each would like to be capable of. So I think in terms of story structure, and again, this kind of shift from one kind of culture that's based on a linear sort of experience that's very coherent into one that's maybe computational and, for better or worse, what might that look like, and what are its potentials?
The question of bias has come up a few times in this conversation, and we're at a point that I'm fascinated by, which is to say, this is a very open question that I don't feel like I have a solid answer to. I recently read Mean Images by Hito Steyerl, so extending the sort of thinking around the poor image, but really looking at it as mean as in average, mean as in means of production, kind of getting to what you were talking about, Anu. Bias seems to be the issue that people can most readily understand as a problem and understand needs to be fixed. And a lot of people have proposed solutions, but then there's always some kind of counterexample to a lot of those proposals. So in that Mean Images article, Style basically argues that we shouldn't be engaging in reinforcement learning through human feedback to make, like what happened recently with Google Gemini, where you have misplaced races and genders in historical presentations because Google was trying to get ahead of possible underrepresentation of certain people. And that was sort of an object lesson in her argument that basically when you try to do this human feedback for reinforcement learning, you end up stumbling into territory that is its own problematic, slippery, unending road. How are you thinking about what we do about bias?
I mean, I feel like Hito's example talks again more about the culture, right? Our need to purge any possible conflict. The fact of the matter is a lot of our history is biased. A lot of our Western history is biased. Our Western art history is completely biased. And what good does it do to insert some people of African descent into a Renaissance painting? First of all, there are Renaissance paintings that include people of African descent. We don't need Google to create them. So one of our big issues is that we aren't doing the work to actually learn the histories that we have ignored because they weren't the favored histories. Instead, we're reinventing fake histories that make us feel good. I call this the pose FX problem, where it's like, oh, you know, I watched Paris is Burning and I felt really bad when everybody died, got sick, was poor, you know, was murdered. And so I'm going to do wish fulfillment version of that, where, you know, 20 years later, people my age who watched helplessly while a generation of beautiful queers was lost to AIDS will just imagine that it was different, that redemption actually exists. I just feel like all of this stuff like you're describing is about us jumping right ahead to spiritual bypass, right? Getting to the correction without solving the problem. So it's human bias that we're really dealing with, always. The computer is not biased. The computer is actually totally unbiased. And that's the whole problem. It cannot apply our biases, our correct ones or our non-correct ones. It cannot execute that judgment because its experiential range is completely flat. And I'm really, again, concerned that we human beings are going to become more like the machine in that way.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I was actually thinking about that on the way here, how AI, to an extent, is a mirror to society, because it really does show us all the things that we've ignored for so long. And to an extent, maybe that's a good thing, because now it's forcing us to address all of the history that we've actively ignored. But yeah.
Yeah, and I would just add on to that I think the work of artists who are showing us how these systems are working and the biases implicit in them. Thinking in particular the work of Trevor Paglin and Kay Crawford and the recent book, sort of large language models, which attributes are given. And just bringing all of that forward and showing us how these things work, I think is really useful response.
I want to kind of end us on the title question of the talk, and we'll see how long or short that goes. And then I want to make space for other folks to ask questions. So the stated question at the title: can AI be ethical? So getting to we've covered a lot of ground in a very short amount of time, but in your perspective, where we sit now, and we all reserve the right to be wrong, can AI be ethical in any way that you would like to take that question?
I guess I would just respond by saying the question itself gives me pause. AI itself is a floating signifier. It means so many different things. And I think that as you sort of get more specific and more particular, there are ways of talking about AI where it can't, well, and the other part of the question that I don't like is that AI itself is none of these things. As we've said a couple of times on the panel so far, it's humans who are biased. So it's not AI itself as an object or an entity that is biased or not ethical. It's really our approach to it, our use of it, and its replication of so many of the patterns within our own culture. That said, I think there are uses of AI that can be ethical.
Ditto. That was, yeah, literally the same thing. Yeah, the first thing that I thought about was like AI technology itself is, yeah, the same, that you can't really decide whether it's not ethical or unethical. It's a technology. But yeah, the way that we use it, what we use it for, if it's for art, what kind of things are we pulling from it? How are we using it? If it's for our day-to-day lives, are we using it to hinder our progress as a humankind? Like, are we using it to hinder our education, or are we using it to actually educate ourselves and use it as a tool? Like, for example, like I said, like how I use it to transcribe. That to me feels like one of those kinds of tools that are helpful, that helps progress our everyday life so that, you know, journalists can write stories quicker and stuff like that. But when it becomes something that is harmful is when it gets unethical.
So I guess when I'm thinking about ethics, I always start with where's the power? And whoever has the power has to maintain the ethics. And that is the sad reality that I think every professor is well aware of. Because we're not always in the position to do it, but it's still our job. And so I think that's where we come in. AI can be ethical if we can be ethical. AI can be ethical if we can relate to one another and to the systems that we work with and in ethically. But we have a long way to go. We are not meeting that bar as a species, as a culture, as a community. So how can AI be ethical? That's a question I'd like to open actually to you all, if you have any thoughts, because I don't really know.
On that note, please. So yeah. Oh. Yeah.
When you were just talking about AI bypassing and like imagining these redemptive histories, it made me think of Yinka Shonibar immediately, and I went, okay, so what's your take on Yinka Shonibar, who painted these paintings of black people at the center of UK aristocracy at the height of like monarchies, whatever, before AI existed, and it kind of made me think about it's humans, not AI. I wonder if you have the same criticism for that person's paintings, or if you take them in a different way.
Okay, great question. I would say that actually the artist that I was thinking of, who popped into my mind as I was saying this, was Kehinde Wiley. Because what Kehinde Wiley is known for doing is taking contemporary African Americans, or contemporary, particularly men of color, and putting them into compositions that are derived from the aristocratic paintings of the Baroque. And I've always had this question when it comes to Kehinde Wiley: what is that actually doing? He says it's elevating the subject by venerating them in a form that is agreed upon as a venerated form. And I say, okay, within the Western context. I think of Yinka Shonibare a little bit differently, because Yinka Shonibare begins with a history which, before he was actively in practice, I think not so many people knew. And he was really very central in popularizing this information about how this particular kind of fabric that we associate with the Back to Africa movement in the 1960s and Afrocentric dress in contemporary times, even in Africa, is actually from Indonesia. And that the fabric was originally based on Indonesian batik, that the Dutch colonists wanted to industrialize the technique. This was a tendency that the European colonists often had to use the factories in Europe to actually compete with the artisans in the colonies in order to destabilize the economic power of the colonies. And so rather than import batik fabric into Europe from Indonesia, they actually wanted to manufacture Indonesian fabric in European factories and sell it back to Indonesians. Indonesians did not want it. But it turned out that a lot of Africans actually really liked it. They didn't think it was traditional African fabric. They just thought it was cool, and they started making stuff out of it. And then Americans, African Americans, or Americans in general, saw that, and they said, oh, this is an authentic African fabric. So this material represents modernity in that respect. I do think that there is potentially a link between that idea and some of what we're talking about when it comes to AI and bias, or AI and ethics. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that, as I said before, people don't learn the actual history that represents the true 600 years of globalization that we've had, or the interracial reality of our histories. Instead, we know this little layer, and then we start inventing stuff. So, yeah, I actually really like Yinka Shonibari. I'll close with that.
Well, thank you so much. I found this very, very interesting and thought-provoking. And I'm thinking of copyright. And copyright being, the traditional way of assigning, I guess, the rights to, especially, it doesn't have to be visual, but for example, a visual image to an artist. But it seems to me that it's sort of an old-fashioned system to a certain extent. It was, introduced in perhaps 1800s. And already when the internet took off, it seems like copyright sort of fell a little bit by the wayside. And even today, even though copyright is still in effect, it seems like it's only people or entities that have the means and the means to pursue their copyright protection. Most small-time operators, it's very hard for them to get something out of that. Now, AI is a continuation here of the internet, and also the way it's being developed is building upon existing images. And I wonder if any of you, see some sort of different, that we haven't, figured out at this time, system to, take artists' right? Maybe not. To me, it seems like it's a lost cause somehow, rather. Copyright today. It's pretty dusty there. But I don't know.
I have a few thoughts about that. So, copyright and AI is very, very muddy. In a lot of the reporting that I did, I came across someone named Stephen Taylor, who made this AI machine that created a piece of art. He tried to copyright it as something made by the AI, and it was rejected. And there's a lot of issues because with copyright, I believe the issue was that under copyright law, it has to be made by a human. And so I think he ended up copywriting it under his own name. That's a big issue. I think another thing that really comes up that you kind of touched on too, which is AI is part of it, but also AI is not part of it. But design, specifically with like graphic design and people who use, graphic design, artists, a lot of their work gets like copied, and when you think about like Etsy and Amazon and stuff like that, their stuff gets copied and it gets put on tote bags and t-shirts and posters and notebooks. And copyright can only go so far in those contexts too. And with AI, it amplifies those issues, especially when it comes to the commodification of their work, because they're not seeing the money that they deserve. And I feel like AI is going to complicate that even more.
There's also a counter reaction. There's a movement of folks who are sort of undertaking this idea of data poisoning. So instead of protecting copyright outright, there are folks who are either trying to poison the data so that like they will apply a pixel pattern that to your human eye the image still looks normal, but when it's trained it messes up the whole data set. So it's like poison. So they're trying to covertly preserve some form of copyright or IP that way. And then there's Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst, who are actually in the their work is in the other room, have done a lot of work. They have a new company called Curator now, which identifies when the information on your website is being scraped, and it blocks those IP addresses automatically. But prior to that, they had a tool called Have I Been Trained, where you could identify if your work had been included in the original data sets that some of the major image generators were trained on, and you could opt out, and Stability, the company that had rolled out Stable Diffusion, which is the largest open source image generator project, would honor the opt-out. So it's sort of a half measure because, of course, the model was already trained using the data, but it wouldn't be included in future iterations of the model. I know that only partly kind of gets at your question, but I did want to bring up that there is this data poisoning movement.
To this point, have you been following the lawsuit that the New York Times has opened against OpenAI? I'm curious what you think of these lawsuits, and if there's, I've heard discussions of whether we'll see in the next year artists striking a deal with OpenAI to license their work. I mean, and I don't even know if that is an optimal outcome, but what do you make of that? Like, is the issue that artists are not getting compensated, and then you need to fight for that compensation, or are there so many other problems attached that that's not really a fix? But certainly it strikes me as a move in the positive direction to reimburse, to have people profit from this massive revenues of these. What do you think of these lawsuits? I don't, maybe you haven't heard them yet.
A little bit more about that. We're hearing about the fake people.
I don't know that much about it, but like OpenAI has trained itself on all of the New York Times, and so that is, what if the New York Times were to win, it would kind of handicap these companies entirely. So.
It would handicap one company. So let's think back. Let's think back to Napster and how that got shut down because it was entirely powered off of copyrighted material. And then a monetization scheme was figured out, and then you get Spotify, where now everything's licensed, but people get such tiny fractions that they still can't live on it, they can't survive on it, and then they start protesting Spotify, right? And so I think that's what we're gonna see, is we're gonna see incremental improvements that still don't really solve the problem, but they get the corporation off the hook. So the corporation's gonna exploit as far as it can, and the law's gonna push back slowly and incrementally. And each time, perhaps we'll get a little bit of a check, a little bit of a respite. But, honestly, I feel like I can't not compare it to the situation right now in Gaza and how every time we go to the International Criminal Court or we go to some other situation, it's like we get this tiny reprieve, a little bit of validation, but the killing just keeps going and going and going. I'm not sure what the law can do on a large scale for people to protect us, because the law also does things like grant corporate personhood. I think that we, the people, have to figure out how we want to use this law. But I think the fact that right now the only entity that can go up against OpenAI in a court of law is something on the order of the New York Times is not a good sign for artists.
I'd echo that completely. And then also on the artist side, there are folks who are trying to explore the micropayments question from a smart contract standpoint. I think that those are liable to fall to the same model that Spotify ultimately, sort of the situation that Spotify created for artists. But it's encouraging that there are at least people trying to use new forms of communicating and pooling some form of value. I am encouraged to see that happening from a sort of open source standpoint. So there are folks who are like there's a tool called Water Lily, which is basically a tool through cloud compute you can train a model on your visual style. This obviously works for a sort of narrow band of like a particular type of visual artist. And then anytime you have then established, like once you have made that model, then people can prompt that. They can essentially treat that as a spawned model of your style. So instead of typing into Midjourney in the style of whomever, they could go to that model, use it, and pay some micropayment that's already been established through smart contract. So, you know, for a few pennies, you can then receive a work that's in the style of this artist, and that's the model that the artist put forward as wanting you to use for that.
So this sounds a little bit like the Kendall Jenner bot, if I remember correctly. Was it Kylie Jenner? I forget. One of them had an AI that, like, if you paid a lot of money, then you could actually get messages from her. But if you paid a little bit of money, you would get messages from her AI.
10 feet from startup.
Hey, so yeah, I wasn't here quite in the beginning, so maybe I missed this in the intro, but so it seems that the argument here that the AI companies are making is basically that the models are not trained on someone specific's work, partly why I say Sova Silverman and some other writers don't seem to come very far with their lawsuits. So what they're basically saying is that we didn't rip anybody specific off, we just ripped everybody off, and we put it all in this model, and therefore it's incredibly difficult to build a copyright case where you could show that someone's work was ripped off. The New York Times, from what I've seen, and I'm no attorney or expert on this, it seems that they just had passages that were basically copied one-to-one, which of course opens them up to liability, and of course was very stupid on the AI company's part. But I think going forward, I mean, I guess the question here, because I mean, the part I'm referring to is like, when you say, you know, can AI be ethical? What would it even mean to be ethical in this context? And I think maybe that's the part, I'm not sure you guys touched upon this in the beginning, but that was my thought. What would it even mean exactly? Yeah. What is ethical? To basically respect copyright? To compensate artists, because as we see musicians, we see how that went. I think the cat is a little bit out of the bag. It's very hard to put back in the bag. So now, what would it even mean to be ethical?
Yeah. I mean, I want to bring it back to this idea that the only way to be ethical is to identify where the power is located and then be led by the less powerful, led potentially by the powerless. That is not the financing model that we have for AI at the moment. And we didn't really talk about the influence of venture capital, but I think that the influence of venture capital and the 3-month profit quarterly earnings cycle is very much responsible for this. And that is all human innovation in economics.
Well, I mean, with that, I think, you know, this conversation has kind of focused on art and images. And I've been, at least it seems to me that all of the money that's going into AI from venture capital is going mostly to these big, you know, large language models, and not to medical AI or, you know, scientific AI. I don't know, but I know that for a while it was hard for tech companies to get VC financing, and then this AI rush happened, and now everyone wants to give all this money. And I think, you know, we're speaking about, well, you were talking about the ubiquity of AI. I mean, it's everywhere. But I think that the attention is on the image verse that we live in, and I don't know where I'm going.
I guess I would argue that maybe the attention of the public is on that. And I think another thing about writing my novel was that I really wanted to point out to people that the things that we're afraid of are the wrong things. That we freak out about things that are actually quite fantasy-like, but the real impact that AI is having right now we're barely aware of at all, and we're not concerned about in that way. Yeah.
Make this the last one.
You spoke briefly in the context, I think, of your teaching about the importance of educating humans, or keeping the workforce human. You said something about, like, it's important that we remember that this is people's livelihood, and it just seems like, listen, the Industrial Revolution happened, and, you know, there are a lot of ways in which AI, as we've talked about today, can be helpful as a tool. There are other ways in which they will replace humans in specific jobs, and we're talking here about writers and about artists and everything else. But what are you suggesting that you're teaching your students or the world about how do you consider keeping humans employed in ways that it might take over from her? You know?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think for me as an educator, one of the most important things is sort of educating people. So while my colleagues were more concerned about plagiarism, I felt very strongly that our students needed to understand how large language models work, how machine learning works, how images are made, how they're generated, what this means about their career, and not say we must only privilege and prioritize human creativity, which is what many of my colleagues are doing, and I hope this isn't being recorded. You know, there's just this idea that, and I honor that, you know, that the young screenwriter coming in to learn screenwriting should not use ChatGPT to generate a script. Sure, I agree with that, but should they understand how these tools work? Absolutely. The minute they leave the campus, they're going to be asked to be using these tools. So I think that part is very clear, that we all need to understand how these things work in very specific ways and then in broader cultural ways, like kind of larger paradigms of thinking and knowing. And then I think more specifically about the labor issue, recognizing that we kind of work in these communities of practice and that we need to help sustain them when they're in jeopardy. And I think in the film industry, we went through this transition with the digital era, massive job loss, massive retraining. Women were especially hurt in this transition from kind of analog, especially editors, analog cutting, into computerized cutting. A lot of boys were doing that work, but girls were not. So there are lots of implications around race and gender and access. And then sort of just communities of making and how we make and what that means to do it and to do it together. And as we transition, I think we need to be imaginative about how we protect each other and sustain each other and we educate each other. And I think for me, that's one of the biggest things is we need this kind of imagination. We can't be, I think so much of what we experience on a day-to-day basis is being overwhelmed and our senses dulled and we're in the midst of these kind of social media vacuums and we need really big imaginations to move forward and imagine a different way of being in our world with AI. And that requires learning and I don't know, the human capacity to imagine.
On that note, thank you all so much.